And this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, President Trump takes on tech. He is floating the word antitrust in relation to Google, Facebook, Amazon. Is there more to this threat? We'll talk about it with Congressman Ryan Costello of Pennsylvania. Plus, gaming companies feeling the heat as China pushes to regulate screen time. But can the country's government really limit how long kids play games? And a huge blow to scooter mania in San Francisco. The city blocks some of the biggest names from operating, and the underdogs beat out the big guys like Uber. But first, to our top story, President Trump rails against big tech once again in an exclusive interview with Bloomberg. I won't comment on the breaking up of whether it's that or Amazon or Facebook. As you know, many people think it is a very antitrust situation, the three of them. But I just won't comment on that, the president told us. He continued to hammer that point home at a rally later on in Indiana. All of this following a string of tweets where the president accused social media companies of silencing conservative voices, an act known as shadow banning. He followed that up by claiming without evidence that Google's search results are biased against him and conservatives. For more, I want to bring in our Bloomberg opinion columnist Shira Ovide in New York, and in Washington, D.C., we've got David McLaughlin, Bloomberg's antitrust reporter. So, David, I'll start with you. Without evidence, President Trump is making these claims. Is there really an antitrust issue here?
Well, when it comes to this issue of whether or not Google and the other sites are suppressing conservative viewpoints, that very likely is not an antitrust issue because of the First Amendment. But the president is certainly not the only person in Washington to be raising these issues. I think it's an interesting moment in Washington at the moment where you have a lot of liberals and conservatives who are saying that many of these companies, particularly Google, Facebook, Amazon, are too big, too dominant, and at the very least deserve some antitrust scrutiny that they haven't gotten for many years.
It's a very curious strategy, given that even the president's own campaign manager acknowledges that Facebook helped him win the presidential election. Take a listen to what Brad Parscale told me a couple of months ago.
I've been very specific that I think Facebook's how we won in a lot of ways. I think President Trump won. I think Facebook is that 0.1% that delivered his message. I think if Facebook wouldn't exist, it would have been a lot tougher. If you're watching Facebook for 4 hours this year, but next year you're watching 3 hours of Facebook, but 1 hour of YouTube, that changes. So we're going to monitor where eyes are going. I think YouTube continues and Google continues to work on that platform and make improvements. I think what Google's done to the search algorithm also to put YouTube results at the top, they continue to put a lot of focus and they understand the value of that platform. So we're watching it closely. We're using it for a lot of things now. We're using it probably more now than we even were in 2016.
So, Shira, in those comments, not only does Brad Parscale acknowledge that Facebook helped the president win, but also that they're going to use Google and YouTube more in the next campaign. How does this make sense?
Yeah, and look, both things can be true, right? That the president and his allies can be among the savviest users of Facebook and YouTube and other internet properties, and the president and his allies can believe that those companies are too big and powerful, right? I think there's a legal issue and there's a political risk issue. So legally, it's going to be a hard case, as the law has developed so far, to prove that Google, Facebook, or Amazon are violating antitrust rules, because there's a very specific test, which is the power of these companies harming consumers? And that's largely based on prices of consumer products. And it's hard to make the case that any of those three companies have really been directly harming prices of things that consumers buy. But there's still a political risk, right? That if the president and his allies or other people who believe, let's say, social media sites are squelching conservative points of view, if that gets people to use Facebook less or to distrust Google more, that is a real risk to those companies. And at the same time, we've seen the FTC and the DOJ antitrust division both say that they're taking a closer look at how the law should be applied to different kinds of companies, including these digital technology giants like Google and Facebook and Amazon. And again, even if you can't win an antitrust case against those companies, you can drag those companies into these lengthy regulatory reviews, as Google itself has been through in the United States and in Europe. And that's both distracting and potentially harmful to businesses there.
So Google's response to the president's remarks has been, search is not used to set a political agenda. We don't bias our results toward any political ideology. Meantime, Google, Facebook, and Twitter have been called to testify next week. We're going to be covering these hearings in depth. Google, for one, has not agreed to send their top person. Facebook, however, is sending Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg. Twitter is sending Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey. David, how do you expect these hearings to proceed, given the tenor of the president's remarks leading up to this?
Well, I think these hearings just go to this sort of ongoing chorus of criticism that, when it comes to, as in the clip you just played, their power over campaigns is very strong, as we saw. So in Washington, I think that you'll see the FTC and the DOJ certainly take a harder look at these companies. I mean, in the next few months, we're going to see the FTC open a number of hearings into antitrust issues. And one of the things they're going to be looking at is tech in particular, and whether the sort of antitrust framework that exists right now, whether that should be changed in some way to address this issue that the products they're selling or they're not selling that are free, and do the antitrust laws, are they able to get at that? And I think that's one of the big issues that enforcers need to be considering and will be.
Sheryl, what are you going to be watching for next week? There was such fanfare around Mark Zuckerberg's testimony. He largely did well. However, the questions from lawmakers were often fairly ignorant. I mean, do you think Congress will be better prepared? And then, on the flip side, how will Sheryl Sandberg and Jack Dorsey perform under that pressure?
Yeah, I do think members of Congress will be better prepared. We saw even with the Zuckerberg hearings that members of the House, which went second after the Senate, they seem to have learned from the senators' mistakes in questioning Mark Zuckerberg. And even though you're right, Zuckerberg did a good job in those hearings, I do think it was revealing, maybe in ways that Mark Zuckerberg didn't intend, that I felt he dodged a lot of questions. He seemed almost embarrassed to kind of explain out loud the business model of Facebook to collect user data and sell advertising against that. And to me, at least, that was revealing and I think damaging to Zuckerberg's and Facebook's reputation. I think Sheryl Sandberg in particular is kind of a well-rehearsed spokesperson for that company. Dorsey less so, although he's had some experience more recently going in these TV interviews and other places. And you just don't know what happens in congressional hearings, right? And these execs can be as prepared as they possibly could be, and you still may have these revealing moments that come out of left field. So I think none of these companies want their senior executives to be trotted in front of the cameras and in front of members of Congress who have access to grind.
David, folks we've talked to think that Google is really missing a big opportunity here by not sending a higher level representative. What could the repercussions of that be down the line if Congress is looking seriously at regulation?
Well, then, I think you saw Senator Burr, Senator Warren say, they're not going to be part of the solution, and if that's the case, then we don't want them here. Look, I think, of all these companies, Google is the one that's been the most targeted by enforcers. So, the FTC here did a long investigation of the company, ultimately closed that, but then they have this ongoing investigation in Europe that's resulted in fines amounting to something like $7 or $8 billion. So it seems to me that they're the most exposed at the moment.
All right, David McLaughlin, Bloomberg News, covering antitrust for us. Bloomberg Shira Ovide, as always. Thank you both. We will be covering those hearings all week. Meantime, a conservative advocacy group is taking President Trump's claims a step further, suing Google, Facebook, and Twitter for alleged anti-conservative bias. The group, called Freedom Watch, claims the three tech giants are violating federal antitrust laws. The suit alleges that they are conspiring to censor conservative political posts. Facebook, Google, and Twitter have yet to respond to Bloomberg over this lawsuit. Coming up, gaming companies have taken a hit as China steps up its campaign to wean youngsters off screens. But can the country really limit game time? We'll discuss next. And if you like Bloomberg News, you can check us out on the radio, listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. China regulators plan to limit the number of new online games and the total number of titles. This as Beijing tries to mitigate the impact of gaming addiction among the nation's children. The new measures come on top of a freeze in game approvals nationwide and further muddies the waters for what has been a rapidly growing gaming industry. Our chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel has that story from Hong Kong.
Shares of game companies, including Tencent, fell across Asia Friday after Chinese regulators said they plan to limit the number of new online games and the total number of titles. That's on top of an earlier reported freeze in game approvals. Authorities, they're concerned by the impact of video game addiction in China as well as the levels of violence. Now, China's Ministry of Education specifically stated these latest moves are aimed at preventing and controlling myopia in young people. And this order might actually be coming straight from the top. President Xi Jinping has publicly spoken about the need to help children's eyesight. Now, shares of Tencent here in Hong Kong, they fell the most since March, and game makers in Japan tumbled as well. Many of those in Japan depend on the China market, like Capcom, as well as Nexon, which gets about half its revenue from China. Analysts like Citi's Alicia Yap, though, say this may not have a major effect on revenues of leading developers such as Tencent and also NetEase, as they already have implemented age-based game time restrictions. But still, the news adds an additional layer of uncertainty about China's game approval process and could pressure shares in the near term. Stephen Engel, Bloomberg News, Hong Kong.
For more analysis, I want to bring in our Bloomberg Intelligence tech analyst, Matt Larson. So, Matt, let's first put this into context. How big is China for the gaming industry globally?
Yeah, so I mean, we're looking at a $125 billion market globally. China and the U.S. maintain roughly half of that market, which isn't surprising given just population distributions. But, you know, another telling fact is as a percentage of GDP, most countries' video gaming is around 0.2%. China is 0.49%. So, you know, pretty significant portion of GDP. These are also huge numbers for the industry generally.
So the government is trying to implement a 1-hour rule for parents to impose on their children of the amount of time a child can sit in front of a screen per day. Is that realistic, even in China?
Yeah, even in it sounds like something coming out of my childhood. But you know, China has done it in the past. There have been regulations on. There's a game, Honor of Kings, where there have been time limitations imposed on underage users. So it's possible. Some of the other regulations that they're looking at are just making the games themselves slightly less addictive. I mean, we in the U.S. have also looked at similar addiction triggering features in games like random generation of various rewards, things like that. But time limitations are certainly something that you can link to a user account and the age of the users. And
right, it's something that the game makers could actually do, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And I think that those are some of the regulations that China is balancing, is how much do you put it on the user or the family versus what are the game makers able to build into the back end of some of these software platforms.
You know, we spoke to the CEO of Razer, a gaming company in China, for their reaction to these regulations. Take a listen to what he had to say.
We don't have any specific concerns, given that the Chinese market is still a huge market, and many of the games over there are doing very, very well. I think engagement with the gamers is still very, very high, and I think it's a matter of time, I think, for the entertainment sector to continue growing over there in China.
China still has the benefit of the sheer size of the population. I mean, how much is this really going to hurt game makers?
Yeah, I mean, they have the benefit of the sheer size. He talked about entertainment spending. Video gaming is roughly 12.1% of entertainment spending. It's projected to increase to 14. The video game market right now is about 32 billion in China. That's looking to expand up to 60 billion. So, you know, when you think about market impact and some of the multiples moving forward, I think the concern is the growth case. Is do these restrictions limit the time frame with which the market expands? I don't think there's any doubt that the market is going to continue to grow. The question is just kind of what rate the revenues will grow, and you know how long people are able to engage with the games, which translates into advertising dollars and revenue generally.
From a political perspective, you know, does it appear that China can regulate its children the same way the country has been able to regulate, you know, sort of middle-aged people? I mean, the one-child policy was in effect for decades. That is now gone. You know, we still see, of course, censorship on search engines and social networks. But that said, is the younger generation of China going to respond as the previous ones have?
Yeah, I mean, it's yet to be seen. I mean, especially in this day and age where, you know, the youth are always kind of looking for ways to get around the regulations that are implemented. And sure, if you have a time limit reg, there are going to be ways to work around that or sign up for multiple user IDs, things like that. So we'll see what the response level is too. But, you know, I think that China is sensitive to both the cultural protectionism, but they're also recognizing that there's opportunity here and revenue growth and some significant business interests as well. So if they get the regulations right, there will be a balance there, and I think that we'll kind of see a little bit of both being served. And you'll always get people on the tail end who are avoiding the regs altogether. So we'll see what they come out with, what eventually gets implemented, and then how effective that is in either curtailing or growing.
It's fascinating, given that the Chinese government has done so much to boost its own domestic companies, you know, blocking Facebook, you know, pushing Google out of the country, blocking Twitter, you know, and at the same time, it's helped companies like Tencent and Alibaba and Baidu thrive without competition. And this seems to be taking quite the opposite approach.
Yeah, it's in the short term. I think it seems to be blowing the other way, and I think that the hope is that China gets the regulations correct on the front end. We've seen some similar regulatory regimes in, say, intellectual property for a long time. China wasn't a big protector. You know, they've gotten hammered recently in the trade discussions, but at the same time, they're kind of setting up courts that might implement some more protectionist measures, things like that. So I think you're seeing a little bit of the scales balance in the long term. So setting up a regime now that might cause some short-term pain for hopefully long-term gain.
All right, Matt Larson, Bloomberg Intelligence, thanks so much for weighing in. We'll keep an eye on those regulations. Well, Arlington, Texas, the home of the Dallas Cowboys and Texas Rangers, is gambling $10 million on what it calls the country's biggest esports venue. The venue is expected to open later this year and will hold up to 2,000 fans. It'll also include shops, team training areas, a broadcast studio, and a VIP room. This, as esports researcher Newzoo predicts, worldwide revenue from esports will reach $906 million this year. Coming up, the battle over the ride-hailing space continues to heat up. Who will get to the public market first, Lyft or Uber? And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. The race for ride-hailers to go public is kicking off. Bloomberg has learned that Lyft, the second largest U.S. ride-hailing company, has hired an IPO advisor in an effort to beat Uber to the public markets. Lyft has hired Class 5 Group for a targeted March or April 2019 debut, and the company is planning to take pitches from banks as soon as September. Here to tell us more, who else but Bloomberg Tech's Eric Newcomer. So is Lyft going to get to the public markets before Uber?
That seems to be the plan. I mean, it's an interesting strategic question if you're the smaller company. You know, Lyft was last valued at $15.1 billion. Uber is this $76 billion company. You know, people hoping for this sort of, you know, generational sort of $100 billion something IPO. So if you're the smaller company, what do you do? And what we're reporting is that their strategic choice seems to be, let's get out ahead of Uber.
Why does that strategy to them make sense?
Well, it means that you probably have more options with bankers. Like, there's this risk that if Uber does this huge IPO, even if you're not the lead bank or the second bank, you might still work with Uber and therefore be conflicted out of working with Lyft later. It also just means there's more capital available. If people haven't already picked a horse, they might sort of jump on and invest in Lyft.
On the other hand, there are risks, right, to being first.
Right. Well, one, people could just hold their horses and wait for Uber. People don't know how to measure you. It's hard to know whether it's to your advantage or disadvantage to be measured against the competition, and you're just a smaller IPO. But it seems like the advantages are leaning more to going first. And sort of getting some attention of its own instead of being sort of an afterthought to Uber's huge IPO.
So Lyft has had a CFO for a while. Uber just hired a CFO. Could Uber speed up and get there first?
That would be a big surprise. I think even sort of late 2019 is going to be a lot of work for Uber. I mean, when we spoke with their CFO, former Merrill Lynch banker, Nelson Chai, he wasn't even willing to commit to that timing until he looked at the books. Now, I spoke with Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO, later, who was like, we're still on track. I like being public, blah, blah, blah. But, that's going to take it's a heavy lift, I guess, to get the late 2019 IPO for Uber. And like you said, Lyft has had a CFO, and I think has had a lot of its key executives in place.
So let's compare the balance sheets and what we know. I mean, you've reported detailed numbers on Uber's financials. Does that compare to what we're seeing at Lyft?
Well, I'm almost scared because we know so much more about Uber's financials because they've been disclosing them quarterly. So we get a very good sense of their billions of dollars of losses, but they've been pretty transparent about it. Lyft is more like your standard sort of private unicorn and is happily keeping its numbers private. So it's been a while since we've got an update. Obviously, they've kept raising money, so they have plenty of cash, but we don't know exactly how much cash on hand or I think what second quarter financials were.
Right, or whether they're losing at the scale that Uber is losing at. I mean, certainly they don't have as much coming in, but, in terms of...
Yeah, I mean, historically relative to revenue, their losses have been pretty big, even compared to Uber, but again, we don't know where things are at the moment. And the U.S. should be sort of a more profitable market than, if you're investing all over the world as Uber is. Uber's competing in India with Ola. Like, Lyft doesn't have that problem. But at the same time, Lyft is spending to gain or hold market share against Uber. So we really don't know. And they've started investing in their own autonomous vehicle research program. So, we could be surprised.
And also doesn't have the international opportunity at this point. Okay, Bloomberg's Eric Newcomer, thank you as always. I know you'll continue to follow that trail. Coming up, we'll talk to Congressman Ryan Costello ahead of next week's social media and search hearings. What will he be asking Jack Dorsey? That's next. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg Technology, I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. All week, President Trump has been focusing his ire on tech giants, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And he didn't let up Thursday night at a rally in Evansville, Indiana. Take a listen.
Look at social media. It's a thing called free speech rights. You look at Google, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media giants, and I've made it clear that we as a country cannot tolerate political censorship, blacklisting, and rigged search results.
The president's comments come ahead of Wednesday's hearings on Capitol Hill, where Facebook COO CEO Sandberg and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey will both appear. One committee that those two will appear before is the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which our next guest serves on. Representative Ryan Costello of Pennsylvania's 6th District joins us now. Representative Costello, thank you so much for being here. So first of all, what do you make of this rhetoric now coming from President Trump around censorship and free speech and this issue that has been dogging these technology companies, and yet some of the things the president is citing come with no evidence?
I think that that's a fair characterization of where we are, the posture of this. There are some politicalization what it does and doesn't go into the algorithms and the content judgment calls when certain tweets are requested be removed. At the same point in time, I do think that there are some constitutional questions around what right does a company have to remove content based purely on the political slant. And what ultimately I think the hearing is going to come down to is, can Twitter point to empirical data that rebuts the fact that somehow, because its owners and its employees may lean left, they're not making content judgment calls that favor those who may lean left? I think that that's the overall gist of it.
So left leaners might say that Twitter does the same to them. What are the questions that you want to ask? Let's start with Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey.
I would point to, number one, what your algorithm makeup, what feeds into that algorithm. I understand some of that is proprietary, but can you demonstrate, can you sort of open your algorithm up to us so that we're able to see that there's not content bias there? I might add, they may have the right constitutionally to content bias if they want to. So if they do demonstrate there is some content bias there, I'm not sure they've even run afoul of the law, but I do think they'd lose subscriptions or folks using the platform. And then I think the other thing that is less about whether there's a philosophical bias there as something even more fundamental, and that is, does your algorithm, in essence, reward extremist rhetoric, be it on the left or on the right? We are at a moment in time where the very fabric of our political culture continues to deteriorate. Some of that, I think, is attributable to what gets said on social media and the way people use that platform. And I might also say that why can someone sign on to Twitter and not even provide who their identity is? This use of bots, I think, allows people much more of a license to say things that they wouldn't say if it were directly attributable to them as an individual. I think that leads to much more harsh discourse. And from a best practices perspective, might it be a better experience for the consumer, for the company, and for our political culture to make some policy changes? This would be in the recommendation realm, not in the legislative prescription realm, to make it a better platform for our country, for users, and for the company.
And what about Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg specifically, given that you've already heard from Mark Zuckerberg whether his responses were satisfactory or unsatisfactory, and also the evidence that there are foreign actors attempting to meddle in our elections again, and that Russia's meddling in the 2016 election could have swung the election in favor of President Trump?
Well, we'll never really fully know. I mean, look, so much noise and chatter and, frankly, inaccurate information gets pushed out by both sides as an election nears. It's really hard to say whether or not the Russia interference contributed to people changing their votes, or would have voted but didn't vote, or did vote but otherwise wouldn't have voted. I think on Facebook, some of the questions are the same as with Twitter. I don't know that we're going to get too much into Russian interference because we did last time. I think with Facebook, there's a couple lines of questioning. One, the European Union just introduced the GDPR, which is a data privacy law that's very far-reaching. I think as policymakers, we'd like to understand how that's impacted the company, whether it may actually be a barrier for smaller companies into the social media marketplace. So we'll want to know their experience in that realm. And then I think another area, again consistent with Twitter, is it the kind of platform that rewards more extremist rhetoric? Then finally, is Facebook a publisher? I mean, there are some constitutional and statutory obligations that come about if you are a publisher related to First Amendment protections. And Facebook regularly uploads a lot of information that really they're the original source and content originator of that information, which prescribes to them much more in the way of legal responsibilities than if folks are just using their platform, uploading content that isn't originated by Facebook.
Now, in an exclusive interview with Bloomberg, the president said, in terms of antitrust issues around these big tech companies, he said, I won't comment on the breaking up of whether it's that or Amazon or Facebook. As you know, many people think it is a very antitrust situation, the three of them, and this includes Google, but I won't comment on that. Do you think that Google, Facebook, Amazon are an antitrust issue?
In short, I think that there are antitrust implications to those companies as they evolve and, frankly, enter into different industries. And that's not a personal jab at any one of those companies. But if you look at the Federal Trade Commission, who would have jurisdiction over those questions, clearly tech companies have grown so large, so quick, and now are in the retail business. They're in the movie-making business. They're trying to get into all kinds of different industries because they have the data. And data in and of itself is a commodity, and with that data, you can do a lot of other business ventures with it. I think Amazon buying Whole Foods is a very good example. So I'm not here saying that any one of those companies has violated antitrust law, but I am saying that the rapid growth and expansion of those companies does give rise to antitrust considerations, and I think we're probably entering a new era of antitrust jurisprudence. We're probably living through it right now, where we are going to need more guidance and enforcement from the FTC moving forward.
How disappointed are you that Google is not showing up next week and sending its CEO? And do you think that will come back to hurt them?
Well, Google does have, I think, some answers that we need to hear from in terms of its advertising model. Yes, I'm disappointed. I think any time that you're called before Congress to answer questions, you should come. There are legitimate public policy considerations that I feel that we are entitled to answers on. Remember, the hearing is rooted more than anything else in consumer protection and creating consumer awareness around these platforms, and in the case of Google, in terms of its advertising models. So yes, I'm disappointed. I think that there'll be other opportunities for them to appear. I hope that they do. When you don't appear, my sense is you don't want to answer legitimate questions surrounding public policy. And when they were asked, they were provided information as to why we would like them to appear.
Now, you are retiring. Are you happy with the job that President Trump is doing? And would you like to see a Republican run against him in 2020?
Well, I think some of the policies that the president has pushed forward are directly attributable to the economic growth that we are enjoying right now, the tax cuts, some of the regulatory reform measures we've taken. We made some Dodd-Frank reform measures. At the same point in time, my feeling is that the president picks fights that are unnecessary, and that it diminishes his ability to be persuasive and to grow larger coalitions for the next tranche of legislative reforms that we would like to see happen. So I will withhold judgment on 2020. But I think that he would be enjoying more support from the body politic if he would stop picking fights, stop going after Mueller, stop entering into the primary battles, and instead just focus on what the job is. I think there are a lot of folks that gave him a chance that didn't support him, and some who maybe reluctantly supported him but didn't want to support Secretary Clinton. And a lot of those folks, I think, have a tinge of disappointment because the president, rather than being a uniter, oftentimes finds ways to be a divider.
Some perhaps more than a tinge. All right, Representative Ryan Costello of Pennsylvania, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Up next, Scoot Scoot. The era of scooter transportation has begun, and cities are finally granting permits. We'll talk to the CEO and founder of a scooter company that just got a permit to operate in San Francisco, but a lot of companies that did not as well. We'll discuss. This is Bloomberg. On Thursday, San Francisco and Santa Monica announced long-awaited permits to operate scooter-sharing services in their cities. Santa Monica gave big players, Bird, Lime, Uber, Lyft, authorization to operate. San Francisco, however, went in a different direction, only awarding permits to smaller players, Skip and Scoot. The companies can run 625 scooters each for a trial period of 6 months. Here to discuss that decision, Skip founder and CEO Sanjay Dastur. Also joining us, Regina Clelau, who reports on city data and is the CEO and co-founder of Populous. In July, Populous conducted extensive research on the social and economic impacts of scooter sharing across the United States. Thank you both for being here. So, Skip, why do you think the city chose you?
Well, we've always started by working with the city first before launching. We created the first pilot program with Washington, D.C. and put that in place before we put scooters on the ground. And we've also invested in technology that serves not just riders, but pedestrians, cyclists in the bike lane. Technology is designed not just for the people using it, but for the broader community. I think both of those resonated with San Francisco.
Now, this is the only scooter company that hasn't received a cease and desist. So, you know, you've got the other bigger players out there like Lime with this saying, you know, this decision is disappointing. San Franciscans deserve an equitable and transparent process when it comes to transportation and mobility. Instead, the SFMTA has selected inexperienced scooter operators that plan to learn on the job at the expense of the public good. Sanjay, what's your response to that?
Well, you know, we've been operating actually electric scooters longer than Lime has. We're pretty experienced in working to provide services that don't just benefit the riders, but the community themselves, and that's an approach that I think is equally important. It's a new industry. Everyone's learning as they go. We're excited to test and refine our systems in San Francisco.
Regina, what do you make of these sort of vastly different decisions from San Francisco and Santa Monica?
Well, I think San Francisco is also a unique city. We found in our study that perceptions of electric scooters were actually dramatically different in San Francisco versus many other U.S. cities, which for the most part found that the majority of people really appreciated having a new transportation solution. And I think there's a backdrop of history here in San Francisco that may have affected how decisions have played out. That being said, I think that there are a lot of opportunities for a lot of different companies to make a difference in cities across the U.S.
So I think you're referring to you know, battles with the ride hailers like Uber and Lyft that came before this. But you know, if San Franciscans are more open to scooters, then why would the city be more closed?
Well, we actually found that San Franciscans were not as open to scooters as most other U.S. cities, surprisingly, because there's a backdrop, we think, of perhaps anti-tech sentiment in the Bay Area. It's sort of an experimental playground for a lot of companies. And so I think that what happens in San Francisco may not necessarily be reflective of what happens in other cities.
So, Sanjay, how do you work with that when you can only put 625 scooters on the road? That's not a lot.
It's not a lot. We hope that number goes up over time. I think electric bike share in San Francisco is a good example of how the city worked with different providers, created a permit process, and ended up with a system that hasn't had that kind of backlash. That's the same approach we think will work here, and sometimes that means staging the number of vehicles and increasing it over time instead of putting them all out on the road on day one.
So, Regina, you guys have done a lot of research on how transportation is evolving in cities, how it's impacting communities. What are the shifts you expect to see? Like, how many people actually want to use scooters and will use scooters?
So what we found that was really surprising is that the adoption rates of mobility services have really rapidly accelerated. In just 12 months, electric scooter share services attracted about 3% of the population in major urban areas. It took car sharing services before them about 12 years to reach that point. And one of the reasons is smartphone penetration is ubiquitous. Basically, every city has very large portions of the population, 80% plus, who have access to smartphones. We see these services most likely growing, and there are network effects across multiple operators and services, and so we're excited to see what happens in the future.
Now, Sanjay, while you have been patiently waiting, you have these competing scooter companies that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. You know, how does that put you at a long-term advantage?
Well, the funny thing is that money is being used to expand into a lot of cities very quickly, but sometimes with the same results you're seeing in San Francisco, which is pausing, waiting, running a permit process, and then choosing to deploy. Or in other cities like Washington, D.C. or Portland, every operator has the same number of scooters, and extra capital doesn't get you extra market share because there's caps for each operator. So that capital actually doesn't end up being an advantage. What's the advantage is actually working with cities, to create these permit processes and collaborating with them to create a long-term relationship. That's actually the value in the long run.
Talk to us about your expansion plans. You're in D.C., you're in Portland. How do you plan to grow into other cities if you are the ones that are going to be more patient?
Well, the process that a lot of these cities are going through can vary in terms of how fast the permits are actually approved. So larger cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, are going to take more time. Smaller cities might choose to put out permits sooner. And we've been talking with all of these cities. So San Francisco is a conversation we started last year. And sometimes these things take longer, and that's okay because we want to roll it out in the right way.
So, Regina, do you think other cities will respond in the same way San Francisco has? I mean, for example, Airbnb is battling with New York, but we don't see city regulators across the country having those same battles with Airbnb. Is San Francisco going to be a unique case, or will other cities take San Francisco's lead and have a similar response?
We believe that in the particular case of micromobility, that cities will, in fact, put in place more regulations than previous transportation services like Uber and Lyft that came before them. There are a couple of key reasons. Number one, they're lightweight, they're small, and they're stationary, and so they're easy to throw in the back of a truck or a van and confiscate. And so it's easy to enforce regulations. There's already been a precedent set by Washington, D.C., Portland, Austin, numerous cities that have established similar permitting processes before San Francisco, and most other cities are following suit.
Sanjay, how profitable can this business be? I mean, you don't have the drivers that Uber and Lyft have to pay, but there's also a question of how many people are actually going to use these.
Yes, we've actually seen a pretty broad swath of population using them, people outside kind of the expected demographic, and I think your study showed that with data. The key driver for this business's profitability is actually the operating cost of the fleet. A lot of people are using consumer-grade vehicles that don't last very long, that require a lot of repair and daily charging, and we think that designing a custom vehicle that's actually optimized for fleet use is both safer and more profitable in the long run.
Either way, though, there's got to be consolidation in this industry. This many scooter players cannot survive. Wouldn't you agree?
I think it depends on how the city regulatory issues play out. A lot of cities have said we want 2, 3, 4 players. We're going to grant an equal number, and that's what the next 12 to 24 months at least is going to look like. After that, we'll see.
All right. Sanjay Dastor, CEO and co-founder of Skip, thank you so much, as well as Regina Clellow, CEO of Populous. Lots to watch evolve here. Great to have you here today. Thank you. Coming up, Google is already in the center of major privacy problems. So how will the company handle new reports of collecting user data from Mastercard use? We're going to talk about that next. This is Bloomberg. Apple and 20 other cash-rich companies used to be the biggest buyers of short-term corporate debt. Now, they've turned into sellers. According to Bank of America, that's left a $300 billion a year hole in the market, and it's making it more expensive for other companies to borrow. The reason why Apple, Microsoft, and others are selling? U.S. tax cuts are prompting them to bring home their overseas cash hoards, which had been invested in short-term debt. Well, it turns out that Google and Mastercard cut a secret deal to track retail sales. Bloomberg has learned that the alliance gave Google an unprecedented asset for measuring retail spend. Select Google advertisers could track whether the ads they ran online led to a sale at a physical store in the United States. The company's never told Mastercard holders of this arrangement. For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg Tech's Alistair Barr. So, wait, what? How did this work? Why didn't we know about this?
They announced the actual technology last year, but they didn't say that they'd done a deal with Mastercard to get it done.
Should they have? Is this legal?
Well, we thought that they probably should have.
And but seriously, though, has a law been broken here in not disclosing this?
No, probably not. It's another classic case of when you sign up for a Mastercard card, when you sign up for Google services, in page 24, paragraph 3, it'll say something like, you give us permission to use data for marketing purposes, and I think that's generally the phrase that Mastercard uses in its agreements for sure.
So Google's already in hot water with the president. We don't know how much teeth his threats could actually have, but how does this sort of pile on to what Google's already dealing with?
I think there's probably two separate issues. So there's the search issue and the bias issue, which seems more of a stretch. On the privacy side, it basically cuts to the core of what Google does. So the general pact we make with Google and Facebook is we get these great services, and in return they get to use our data. They don't always tell us specifically every time that they're using our data what it's for, and that's really the rub here, right? Where they're going to have to tell people more about what they're doing more often, and that's going to freak people out.
And haven't there been issues with other Google services like Gmail or Android where they're doing similar things, but users don't quite understand how they're using that data? And it is so curious why that ad for the trip to Costa Rica shows up when, you know, somehow elsewhere, I've asked someone about Costa Rica.
So the Gmail example, that was many years ago, and that was probably the first sort of classic internet privacy scare in the US, and you know, it's still happening. You know, probably 10 years ago, right? 10 years later, it's still happening. So obviously, it's so important for Google and these other companies that they're not going to change what they're doing here. They're probably just going to have to explain it a lot more.
How much did Google pay Mastercard for this data?
We know it was millions of dollars, and we don't know exactly how much. It probably over $10 million for sure.
All right, a story we'll continue to follow. Alistair Barr, our Bloomberg Tech editor, thank you so much for stopping by. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Tune in next week. We are gearing up for Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey's debut before Congress, as well as Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg. You don't want to miss it. This is Bloomberg.